Well, good morning and welcome everybody one more time to Encounter. A little over a year ago, we set out this goal of 1,000 courageous steps of faith. And we defined courageous step of faith by worshiping for the very, very first time, joining a small group or maybe a serving team for the first time, sacrificially giving for the first time. And we offered this encouragement, this goal to, as a community, take 1,000 of these individual courageous steps of faith. And of course, baptism is a huge one of those, showing the world you've been raised with Christ, is a courageous faith. But we took this survey a little while ago, and it also highlighted like 75% of you in the room, Fulton Heights, worshiping online, took these courageous steps, took at least one step in the past year. And we want to recognize that, we want to celebrate that, and we want to tell those stories. So in order to tell them, we have to hear them. So there's a QR code in the seat back in front of you. There's also a link on the screen. And we'd love for you at any point, we're a phone-friendly church, just to scan that code, and it's going to have some prompts in there, and whatever you'd like to share with us, just to share that story of your courageous step and see how God intersected your faith with his ocean of faithfulness. As we heard earlier a few times, today could be your day. There's no reason why today can't be your day to show the world you've been raised with Christ. And every year that we do this, every time we do this, people come out and say, like, yes, I'm ready for today to be my baptism weekend. And we don't want anything to stand in the way. So anytime during the message, if you sense the Spirit of God like whispering into your heart, maybe this thing is for you, go to the table in the back. If you're wondering, hey man, I wasn't planning on this, I don't want to go home soaking wet, I've got plans after this, we have you covered. Like literally, we have shirts, we have shorts, we have underwear, we have everything that you need in order to go home well. If you're worried about friends, family members not being here, we have that settled as well. We've got people, a photos team, taking pictures to capture the moment. But the bigger picture on all of this is the story that you get to share. The time that you said yes when Jesus was knocking on the door of your heart. If you're wondering, this is a big decision. I need to process this like in community, or process this a little bit longer. I need to pray about this. That's a really good response. And I'm glad that it's sitting with you. I'm glad that the gravity of the moment is weighing on you. But just do me a favor and don't process this in isolation. Do it in community. Do life together. Head to the table in the back. Let somebody know. Help me understand this. Help me process this through. We've got people set up ready to pray for you. Just head to the table in the back anytime. As we already heard, we're continuing on in this series, Jesus and Mental Health. Last week we took a sober look at where is Jesus in the midst of anxiety, and we heard a pretty powerful story there. Next week we're hearing more stories. Where is Jesus in the valley of depression? Today we look at where is Jesus when the pain is almost overwhelming. Where is Jesus? When it hurts so incredibly badly, where is Jesus? In the valley of the shadow of loss. Today's Jesus in grief. Some of you are grieving, and you've courageously shown up today. I want to honor that and respect that. Some of you are not in the valley of loss. You're not grieving. Grief is an inevitable part of life. Loss is a part of life. There's going to be some nuggets, there's going to be some truths that are shared here. I just want to encourage you to store these away like a squirrel storing up nuts for the winter. Like you guys, a winter is approaching, this barren wilderness of loss and of grief. And I'd love for you to hold on to these for a time when you can return to them. I'd like to begin with a story of myself. I remember the very first time somebody close to me passed away. Somebody that I knew well. I was at a school event. I came home. Some friends dropped me off. And my parents weren't home, which was very unusual. Even more unusual, my older cousin was sitting at the table. And she said, reading the confused expression on my face, there was a car accident. Grandpa is in the hospital. And Grandma died at the scene. I mean, there was a lot to process, right? Being on the relative younger side, especially for grandparents, I thought that I had more time. But as we enter into this valley together, we recognize that all grief is a multifaceted kind of grief. I lost my grandma. My mom lost her mom. My grandpa lost his wife. I actually don't know how long they were married, but I remember the 50th anniversary. His whole life, I don't think he ever stopped grieving. There were moments of laughter. There were moments of joy. I remember talking to him about a trip that he was taking. I think it was an international trip. He was really excited about it. He was looking forward to it. And just a wave hit him all at once. And his face went downcast. His demeanor shifted. And he said, and you know, I would just give it all up to have one more day. His whole life, I don't think he ever stopped grieving. What do you do with a grief like that? How do you navigate a grief like that? A little while ago, some of our young adults around here decided to dig into this in a ministry that they called Roadmap, where they did a deep dive into biblical lament. Because in this book that we have here, it doesn't sugarcoat things. It doesn't gloss over things. It dives down deep into the emotional reality that is grief. And I love that we have a God who walks with us and who meets us in that valley and doesn't like pretend like everything is okay. And that we have in our church community some young adults who are saying, we have to know more. We have to learn this language of lament. If you've ever wondered if the church is in good hands in the future that's coming, I assure you it is. They learn about this Hebrew word in the Old Testament, ikah, how long, God, how could you? Just taking all of these emotions, taking all of this grief and just laying it squarely before God and saying, how? In light of everything that I know about you, how does this continue to happen? That's the journey. That's navigation. That's grief. That's what we're going to learn about this morning. But I want you to know that grief doesn't have to be limited to like human loss. Yes, a loss of life involves a certain kind of grief, but there's another kind of grief, an element. Sometimes a grief that goes far too long, unnamed. It's a kind of grief of losing a role or losing a job. And there's like a grieving kind of loss of income, sure. But you guys know that a job is more than just a way to get money. It's like you pour a certain amount of your identity into that work, identity into that job. It's not just a loss of a job, it's a loss of identity. Your social group, your people become the people, the customers and the coworkers that you work with on an everyday basis. It's not just a loss of it, it's a loss of them. And mourning that they're no longer in your life. Losing that part of your identity along with that. The grief is so much more. It's a diagnosis for a loved one, a diagnosis for a kid. And they're going to be fine. They're going to be okay. They're going to be healthy and strong, and they're going to grow up. It's not that kind of diagnosis, but it is a kind of thing that looks like the future is far different than what you thought it was going to look like. And so you're like grieving that I guess my kid's future isn't going to be what I thought. I talked to one person who sat down and said, I tell you what I'm grieving. I thought we were going to be that couple in the rocking chairs on a porch watching the sunset. I don't know if anybody actually does that. I thought it was cute. I thought it was a little cheesy, but I wanted that so very badly. And signing the divorce papers was like sealing that future into the grave. What are you supposed to do with a grief like that? We're not solving grief today. We're navigating grief today. And the dual hope in the Jesus and Mental Health series, anxiety, depression, today, grief, the dual hope throughout this whole thing is two modest and humble truths that I would love nothing more than for you to be starkly aware of, is that number one, you are not alone. And there is hope. And the story that we're going to read today, I think, captures that so incredibly well. You are not alone. In fact, you have a Lord and a Messiah who walks through the valley of the shadow of loss and navigates some of the pitfalls along the way. And he shows us a few things on how to do that as well. He provides us that hope as well. If you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn to John chapter 11. We're a phone-friendly church, so if you look that up on your phone and take notes that way, that's encouraged. We love that. Blue screens on your face. I just assume it isn't Instagram. We're going to get into it here. John chapter 11, we started off. Jesus is, he's mourning the loss of his friend Lazarus. Lazarus has died. And I don't want you to hear this like, oh yeah, a man has died, like it's a generic kind of news article about somebody a long ways away. Lazarus was a brother. Mary and Martha were his sisters. He's a real person. He's about 30 years old. He had a lot of life ahead of him yet when he dies. He's a friend. He's Jesus' close friend. And Jesus courageously decides, let's go be with the community that he left behind. And so verse 17 in John 11, it starts off, on his arrival, that's on Jesus' arrival, which is a huge deal in and of itself, because the disciples, if you can believe it, they tried to talk him out of it. They're like, Jesus, don't go to Jerusalem. Don't go to Bethany where he's from. It's just outside of Jerusalem. You know, last time you were there, it was just a little while ago, and they tried to kill you. If you return, they might finish the job. And they weren't wrong. But Jesus, I think, knowing what his future holds, what his Lord holds for him as he goes to that place, what his Father holds, he goes anyway. And we're going to come back to that thought towards the end. Continuing on to verse 17. On his arrival in Bethany, just outside of Jerusalem, Jesus found that Lazarus, his friend, had already been in the tomb 4 days. It's significant, 4 days, because they had this belief, possibly a superstition, that the soul would just kind of hang around the body for 3 days, awaiting an opportunity to return. But 4 days was when decomposition started to set in. And so the soul, after 4 days, decided to leave and left. It was gone. I want us to hear this. By the time Jesus shows up to his friend's funeral, there was no physical or spiritual framework for hope or help. But Jesus shows up anyway. Verse 18, Bethany, where all this was taking place. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews came to Martha and to Mary. Many Jews came out to Martha and Mary, the sisters, to comfort them in the loss of their brother. People are coming from 2 miles away. I think we start to get a sense as to like who Lazarus was. You know, we don't get a lot of details about the guy, but we know that he was worth people traveling for miles on foot just to be there, just to be with the community, just to provide any kind of relief, any kind of comfort to the sisters, to everybody else who was mourning. And you know, when a large group of people like sets in at a funeral like this, you know what happens, right? Besides the ham bun and potato salad, like what else happens? At just about every funeral I think I've been to, there's a large group of people that come all at once, and you see the sisters lined up there. There's a hug line that starts, you know, where they're there, and as people start to pass through, and they start to offer their words of comfort. Now, some of them might have helped. Those of you on the receiving end of a hug line, you know the ones that don't. You know the words that do more harm than good. Words like, everything happens for a reason, you know. He's in a better place now. I don't want to deny the truth of the words. The timing is a little off, though. When people go through the hug line and they offer their words to Mary and Martha in the depth of their loss, there's several pitfalls that we're navigating around on this journey of grief. Some of those pitfalls, yes, to over-spiritualize things, you know, to rush the process along, to go right towards heaven and everything is perfect again. There's a minimization that's a pitfall of going through that line and saying words that minimize the loss that Martha is experiencing. There's words that people go through that deny some of the pain or some of the sting that death brings. There's pitfalls of ways not to navigate grief by blaming some of this on other people around. We can, if only we had caught it earlier, you know. If only we had switched doctors at a better time. If only the other driver wasn't so distracted, then we wouldn't be here right now. Right? Minimize, denying, blame. There's a lot of places that we can go for this, but those things maybe have their time. It's just not now. It's just not in that moment. You guys have heard the expression, success in life, 90% of success in life is just showing up. 90% is like an A. I mean, A minus maybe, depending on the curve. I don't know. But like, a 90% in my book is pretty good. Show up at Bethany. Show up at the funeral. Show up. You already got an A. Maybe if you aren't sure about it, you don't have to open your mouth and start reducing the grade. Just show up. There's a lot of pitfalls. There's a lot of areas that we can go wrong. Some areas that we can go right. A book, View from a Hearse, a man loses 3 sons, well acquainted with grief. He says he's sitting there, he was torn by grief. Somebody came by and talked to me of God's dealings, of why it happened, of hope beyond the grave. He talked honestly. He said things I knew were true. I was unmoved, except to wish he'd go away. He finally did. Another came and sat beside me. He didn't talk. He didn't ask leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or more, listened when I said something, answered briefly, prayed simply, left. I was so comforted, I hated to see him go. Jesus shows up to his friends. There's a counselor that I talked to one time, and I don't know if it's just like a West Michigan thing in particular, but he said, West Michigan culture is emotionally constipated. We have a hard time processing this because we like keep it all in. And then when it inevitably does come out, it's sloppy, it's messy, and it just spills out everywhere. It's nasty. Don't do that. Don't do that. Engage the process, engage grief. If you're looking for a takeaway on this thing, listen, grief will not be rushed. Don't rush it. Embrace it, dig into it, but don't rush it. Verse 20, listen to the emotion. Verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, and I imagine her, she's like digging her finger into her Lord's chest. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Something that we have to know about Mary and Martha at this moment, a Jewish custom, it's called sitting Shiva. Shiva is the Hebrew word for 7. It's very simple. For 7 days you grieve. For 7 days you mourn in a very public-facing way. I think for much longer you continue to grieve, but this is the prescribed process. 7 days. 7 days of no new clothes. 7 days of no cooking. 7 days of no cleaning. 7 days of hanging a blanket over a mirror to cover up so that you have no distractions but to embrace, but to sit with the grief. And she's supposed to be sitting with the people around her. She's supposed to stay seated, but she hears somewhere that Jesus comes in. And so she breaks her sitting Shiva. She breaks her 7. She stands, John tells her, make sure we notice that. She stands up, she goes out to him, and she buries a finger in his chest and says, if you had not been here, if you were here, this wouldn't have happened. If you were here, my marriage would have made it. If you were here, they would have been fine. If you were here, everything would still be better, but you weren't. I think we can identify with that one. That's lament. I'm dropping this at your feet because this is where it belongs, Lord. If you were here, this would not have happened. Wait a second, I thought she was sad. I thought she was heartbroken. I thought she was mourning. Yes. But she's angry. She's burying a finger in Jesus' chest. Yes. This is what grief is. It's a messy cocktail of all of the emotions, sometimes all of the emotions at once. It's sad, it's anger, and then the next line we get an even new one yet. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. That's a picture of real grief. She's sad, she's angry, she's hopeful, all at the same time. And she's not alone, verse 32. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. Sometimes people talk about the stages of grief, and I'd like to bring a little clarity on that one. That there aren't stages of grief. Right? People talk about sadness or anger, denial, bargaining, and then finally acceptance. Like it was this clean-cut process. Research and also testimonies of people grieving show it's not that neat. Sometimes there's anger. Sometimes there's sadness. Sometimes there's weeping. Sometimes there's hope. And sometimes all of these things happen all at the same time. So author of this book, Through the Eyes of a Lion, he's a pastor. He shares his personal story about losing his 5-year-old daughter days before one Christmas. In the valley that he found himself in. And he likened grief, he likened it to wading in the surf, where waves would come and knock into you. And sometimes like big waves would come, and the water, not only the wave, but the water sucks out under you, and then the wave topples from over you, and it's even expected, it's unexpected. It twists you upside down. Down is up is down. You have no idea. You have no idea what's what. You're just trying to like get some of your bearings. And he goes, that's what grief is. It's like these waves smashing in. And sometimes it's tolerable, and sometimes it's okay. And then sometimes it's just really, really not. And you never know when those times are, because for some moments you're braced for impact and you're ready. You know the wave is coming. It's on the anniversary of her death. And so you brace for impact. But at other times a wave comes. You had turned your back on the sea and it just smacks you unexpectedly. It's a random 4th of July and all of your kids have sparklers in their hands except one who's not there. And it's this upside down kind of waves of grief. It's not a process. It's all of them, all at the same time. And there's Jesus. In the middle of it all, verse 35, and there's Jesus, along with his friends, along with Mary, along with Martha, and he's weeping. It's the shortest verse in your Bible. Jesus wept. I think it might be the deepest. There's a lot to that line. He's not denying his emotions. He's engaging them and he's walking right into them. Jesus wept. He groaned agonizingly. The word for Jesus wept, the Greek word that John chooses to use here, it's a word that's also used elsewhere in Roman thought, in stories, in literature, in descriptions. And the word for Jesus, for wept here, is that Jesus, upon being in the valley of loss, he reacted, the word is wept, he reacted as an agitated horse who's angry. And like that's the other times that people use this word to describe like farm animals getting frustrated. And you have this picture, and I have this picture that sometimes we learn in Sunday school of like gentle Jesus, meek and mild. And now we see this picture of Jesus with his ears back, pawing at the ground with like saliva pouring out of his mouth. He's upset. Jesus groans. He weeps, and he leaves it before his Father in heaven. That's Jesus. Now, from a story like this, we can start to unpack. We can start to identify some signs, some guideposts to help us not solve grief. We're not solving grief, but we're navigating through it together. And I just want to offer you from the story these 3 quick signposts to help you navigate grief. And again, maybe you're in the midst of it right now, maybe you're not, but you will be. A loss is a part of life. Guidepost number 1, Mary, Martha, Jesus, they're together. The first one is do life together. Do life together. We say around here a lot that you can't do life alone. Man, you cannot do loss alone. There's this temptation toward isolation, and nobody faults you for that. Nobody blames you for that. How could you? Nobody knows what you're experiencing. You're right. I'd honor that. You're right. But there's a temptation to use that and to kind of withdraw away from people because they couldn't understand anyway. Don't withdraw. Stay engaged. Life together. If you find yourself in the blessed position of not being in the valley right now, of not grieving, invest in a community to rely on. Grief is a team sport. Loss is a team sport. People there to be angry with you, to be sad with you, and in time be hopeful with you again. Guidepost number 1 is to do life together. Guidepost number 2 is to embrace grief. Because as soon as grief shows up in our culture, what do we tend to do? When grief makes an appearance, we try to escort grief out of the building as quickly as possible. Let's be done with this. Let's get it out of here. I'm uncomfortable with it and I don't like it. Let's be done. Jesus, even at the risk of losing his own life, he shows up in Bethany just outside of Jerusalem. He physically goes. Some of you just need to hear, to go to the funeral, to write the card, to send the email, to make the phone call, to show up in this physical form. But Jesus also, braying like an angry horse, he's engaged emotionally. He's not denying that he is experiencing these things. He's putting them all on display so that everybody knows which particular emotion he's feeling in that moment. Embrace grief, especially because there's an alternative. I might as well tell you because you're going to figure it out one way or another. You can actually numb the pain. That's an option. We don't talk about it very much, but that's an option that a lot of people take. Alcohol will numb the pain. Painkillers, substance abuse will numb the pain. Investing into toxic relationships will numb the pain. Busyness, a full calendar, will numb the pain and take a little bit out of it away. Small word of caution, though. According to Brene Brown, you can Google her. She does a lot of work in this space. Awesome quote. You cannot selectively numb pain. Substance abuse, alcohol, busyness. You can numb the pain. The problem, though, is that everything else gets numbed along with it. You can numb the pain, but at the same time you're numbing pain, you're numbing joy. At the same time you're numbing pain and grief, you're also numbing the potential of laughter, the potential of happiness, the potential of hope down the line. You cannot selectively choose pain and just eliminate that. It has to be all of it. An effort to offer you the guideposts of not resisting the temptation to do life alone in isolation, resist also the temptation to numb that pain. But like Jesus, to embrace it head on. Embrace grief. And keep an open door, a reservation for hope. Even as you embrace grief, invite hope. I don't want to promise you that hope will automatically live after one message on the topic and one hopeful story. I'm not that ambitious this morning. But I would ask of you this one thing. To keep the possibility of laughter open again. To keep the possibility of joy open. Of happiness open. Someday. If not this day. Jesus' life together, embracing grief, inviting hope. Verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, he came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. If you've heard the Jesus story before, this should sound familiar. Verse 39, take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time, and she says, there is a bad odor, for he had been in there 4 days. And we're not like a King James kind of church very often, like an old school King James, but it's appropriate in this context. The old King James version, translation of the Bible said, instead of there's a bad odor, he said, but Lord, he stinketh. And I just think that's appropriate. He stinketh. And Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you will believe, you'll see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked up and he said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. You always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, he called out in a loud voice and he said, Lazarus, come out. Now, before we hear the next line, I want us to be in that moment, that everything hangs on that moment. If nothing happens, then as Paul writes to the Corinthians, our faith is useless. So is our preaching and the story. We are to be pitied above all people if nothing happens. But if something happens, then anything could happen. He calls out, Lazarus, come out. And I think there was a pause. And John writes those next words, the dead man came out. The dead man comes out of the grave. And John, he writes this story as a down payment on hope, not a final hope. Because we can't prove this, but according to the best timelines that we have available to us, in John's own lifetime, by the time he wrote this story, Lazarus had probably died a second time. And there wouldn't be another resurrection for him until the resurrection at the end of the days. But John chooses to include this story because he wanted you to know not to do life alone. He wanted you to know to embrace the grief. He wanted you to know to invite the hope. He wanted you to know that the significance and the importance of the story isn't just that resurrection happened, it's that resurrection happens. Is that we can have something to hang on to. We can have hope to hold on to. And we might store that truth away like a little nut in the ground until we need it, until we're ready for it. But I keep an open reservation for hope one day returning. A friend and mentor of mine is well acquainted with grief and loss, and he writes from an extraordinarily wise perspective. And he's known to offer this blessing to anybody who would find themselves in this unwanted position of grief and mourning. He says, may God meet you, and may God bless you. May laughter, joy, and happiness one day return to your life. May God's presence and goodness meet you in 100 unexpected ways. That blessing, a version of it, is recorded in the inside of his book, The Land Between. And that last line struck me. To those of you walking through the valley right now, it's Saturday. You're grieving in your mourning the loss, the trauma of Friday's crucifixion. You're looking forward to a future of a Sunday resurrection, but right now it's Saturday. May God's presence and goodness meet you this Saturday in 100 unexpected ways. We're going to celebrate just a few of those unexpected ways this morning. There's some people in our story, in our community, who are sharing their story about God's goodness and grace showed up in their life in 100 unexpected ways. And we're gonna hear their stories. We're gonna celebrate their baptisms, and we're gonna celebrate them. We're gonna celebrate these stories. We're gonna clap when they come up out of the water, because this is a pretty awesome thing. But as we do, may Jesus receive the glory. As we do, may Jesus receive the honor and the praise. As we do, let's remember, Jesus is the king of this story. Jesus is the reason why we celebrate. Jesus is the reason why we can make it through Saturday, because we know that we have a Sunday just on the horizon. A little while ago, Emily and I were talking about her story and identifying the fingerprints of God in her story. And she made the courageous decision to show the world she'd been raised by Christ by getting baptized. And so we just set a date on the calendar. Okay, here's a few. The one she picked was October 30. After we set that date, we figured, we might as well invite a few other people who have been having conversations with Jesus about what he means in their lives. And this story, the goodness of God, multiplies and multiplies 100 unexpected ways. And now there's 9, 10, maybe more, I don't know. So many stories of people showing the world they've been raised with Christ. at Kentwood, Fulton Heights, we have a lot to celebrate this morning. We have a resurrected Lord to celebrate this morning. So Emily, I would love for you to come forward and let's hear Emily's story now.
Emily says, in my early teenage years, I experienced some hurt from the boys in my school. I felt a lot of shame and didn't tell my parents, and I believe the enemy used these early experiences to lie to me about where to find my identity and where to look for love. As I got further from the truth, I developed terrible anxiety. Then in January of 2021, I got COVID, and that's when the house of cards I had been building my life on came down. Overall, I was feeling uncared for, anxious, and alone. All of these things I had built my trust on were shaken. And that's actually where I was met with Jesus' life-changing love. Everyone that treated me at the hospital, from the two EMTs, the 2 nurses, the patient escort, lab tech, and 2 doctors treated me with so much love and kindness that I knew that Jesus was with me in that hospital. He spoke to my heart and wrapped me in his love in a way I had never experienced before. I was filled with overflowing joy, and all the shame and false identities didn't matter anymore because I had encountered his love. Over the past year and a half, God has been teaching me so much, and it's amazing to see how he is able to redeem and restore the broken parts in me, even though I turned away from him and I don't deserve his mercy and grace. God has been teaching me to put my identity in him, and if I seek first the kingdom, everything else will fall into place. It is a joyous relief to let go and trust him, and it ends with a heart emoji.